Okay, so I would like to start by giving a bit of context for the reading that Alma will give us today. She'll be reading from her book, Dancing with Cuba, which was published, what was it, Alma, 1998, was it?
Oh, no, later, 2001.
2001, okay.
2001.
So I'm not sure what you heard in Czech about the biographical background,
Never mind.
but just a little bit of that. And I would begin by saying that Alma Guillermoprieto is a student of human nature who has really seen the best and probably more the worst of it and written about it, and of course a lot of the gray areas in between. It came as no surprise to me, and perhaps not to you either, to learn that she had a background in dance, studying in Mexico where she grew up. And then later in New York, really during the glory years of the American avant-garde, Alma studied with some of the greatest innovators of the day. But for me, I think that you're a dancer at heart because you can hear it in the cadence of the writing, in the flow of the thoughts, really, but also in the bravery of this work, because to dance, literally and otherwise, you have to be brave. So this memoir that you'll be hearing a reading from, Dancing with Cuba, to me really delivered the urgency and the excitement of being young at this time, in this case in New York, which was the late 1960s, early 1970s. This was a time when the status quo was under assault and people were in the streets demanding peace in Vietnam, civil rights for African Americans, and also equal rights for women. But at the same time, all of the art forms were breaking with convention. So film, literature, theater, dance, music, every art form was breaking with convention to the extent that artists were really considered revolutionaries at that time. But then, I guess, dance and chance took Alma to Cuba, where she discovered revolution of another order. She was 20 when she started teaching at the state-owned National Dance School in Havana. Havana, a place where people lived on very little but worked extremely hard and willingly for the sake of Fidel Castro, but also for the belief in the possibility of an ideal collective. The Cubans' trust and generosity, I think, were as striking as their contradictions. This comes across in your work. After that, Alma studied dance in Brazil, a megaculture composed of many smaller cultures, some of which are disappearing as we speak. Experiencing these countries, I think, must have deepened your sense of social conscience as a young woman, because you stopped dancing and turned to writing and journalism. Covering the Nicaraguan Civil War for The Guardian, and then she moved to the Washington Post, risking her life in San Salvador. Alma, with another colleague from the New York Times, investigated the 1981 massacre of 800 civilians by the Salvadoran army, which was sponsored by the USA. It was the kind of story that when it broke, Ronald Reagan's White House called it fake news, but the truth came out, as it always does, when there's people brave enough to find it and to share it. So aside from her many nonfiction books, Alma reports on Latin America, relating the contexts and nuance of current events there with grace and penetration. Writers of her experience and sensibilities are rare. So I turn it over to Alma for her reading now from Dancing with Cuba.
Thank you, Maria.
You're welcome.
We both have the incredible honor of standing in this beautiful space. And just to be surrounded by such beauty makes one feel better about oneself, really, and makes the whole event worthwhile. So I've been a little surprised at how everybody so far in this festival has kind of dumped on beauty. And I would like to put in a good word for the value of beauty, which is a human need. And we all try to create it at some point in our lives, whether we fail or succeed. It's really part of our DNA. There's investigation now to see whether beauty is not part of a Darwinian process of survival of the fittest, but whether beauty exists for the sake of beauty, even in animals. I think we have emotions because we are animals and not the other way around. And so the need for beauty is instinctual in us, and I'm grateful to be in the middle of it. I'm also grateful to the festival for this invitation, which I never expected. I'm very grateful to you, Maria, for taking the time and the care for this introduction, and to you for showing up at this hour of the day on a Saturday. Thank you. A little context about this is from a book that I wrote 20 years after I lived in Havana teaching dance. The context is that I had been rejected. I had been dancing with the choreographer Twyla Tharp when she was young and just doing very avant-garde things, not in theaters, not with music, in tennis shoes. It was a wonderful time to be alive in the arts in New York. And I wanted more than anything in the world to be part of Twyla's core company. But she didn't want me, and it broke my heart. And because it broke my heart, when Merce Cunningham, at whose studio I trained, when he said there's this gig in Cuba that you might want to take, when he made that invitation, I said, sure, I'll take it, why not? It was a form of suicide. And so I showed up in Cuba utterly unprepared. I'd had no interest in politics. And this is the story of my 6-month-long conflict between my seeing myself as an artist and the Cuban Revolution's insistent message that art was essentially worthless, that it was a decoration, that it was superficial, that truly honest and worthwhile people were revolutionaries, but not artists, and where the repression of artists was specific and ongoing. However, during one magical week as a foreigner in Cuba, it was very hard to go to Cuba, by the way, in those days. There were very few foreigners. I had to wait for my visa for 5 months. And so during the anniversary of the revolution, in a very difficult year for Cuba, I had lost 8 kilos while I was there, just trying to keep myself fed and dancing at the same time. There was this one week where we were invited to celebrate the revolution. And so this part that I'm going to read is about the celebration of the revolution as I am twisted into coils of pain by the growing sense of my own worthlessness as an artist. Food and drink, days at the beach, and tourist excursions, this was the Cuba that most visitors to the island knew. But the delegates who had come to celebrate July 26 were very particularly interested in another type of outing. With the notable exception of the Mexican North American delegation, 2 dance colleagues from the United States, there were 3 of us, all of the rest were career revolutionaries, or people like Manuel, a Chilean doctor who had a profession but practiced it in the public sphere. They were enormously curious about the revolution. They wanted to open its hood and see how its engine looked, and they didn't want to waste any time. In those days, a leftist militant who wanted to visit the island of his dreams couldn't simply ask for a visa and go there as a tourist. He had to be invited, and the government invited very few people. Among the 100 or 200 delegates who clambered in and out of the Chile buses with us, there was certainly more than one who was freeloading off the rebel cause. But most of them had earned their invitations through hard work and sacrifice, often including torture and imprisonment, that had brought them revolutionary prestige. These were the foreigners, primarily Latin Americans, whom the revolution wanted to exalt. And now it was taking them to see those of its own achievements it was interested in exalting. Another way of putting it is that we went to visit the things the revolution liked to dream about. And given that all the delegates like to dream about the revolution, during those final outings before July 26, guests and hosts alike entered into a blissful and almost lubricious realm of shared fantasy. The cows received the most applause. They were so irresistible, so calm, fat, and stupid, so oblivious to the triumph of their own existence. The cows were presented to us at an experimental farm on the outskirts of Havana, from whose emerald plains and white laboratories the general misery of the Cuban countryside was impossible to deduce. It was this farm right here, that was going to do away with poverty forever, its director announced. He spoke as if he were parodying Fidel with identical pauses, reiterations, and discursive tone. Our task here is not an easy one, he began, standing with his feet apart and his chest thrust forward as if he were facing down gunfire. Esta revolución has made a commitment to guarantee each of its children 1 liter of milk every day, at least until they are 8 years old. His right hand tossed an invisible toreador cape over the shoulders and came to rest on the back. But as it happens, there are 2 sorts of cows in the world. The cow that gives milk, la vaca que da leche, the Swiss, Dutch, or English cow, which gives up to 33 liters of milk per day, and the cow that can take the heat, which is the zebu, the female zebu, which was developed in India. But the cow that can take the heat doesn't give milk. That animal is a very poor milk producer. It gives you 11, 12, maybe 15 liters of milk per day, and after that, it gives you no more. So then, what are we doing here? Well, we are going to produce a new type of cow. The cow you are looking at now is a cross between the Holstein and the Zebu, which perfectamente resiste nuestras condiciones climatológicas and has an average milk production that should be as much as 38 liters per day when the crossbreeding has been perfected. His index finger turned downward, his torso twisted triumphantly while he presented the conclusion. Este pequeño animal, this little animal, is named Daisy. Pure white and not very big, with a delicate muzzle and a rounded body, Daisy gazed upon us with the eyes of Hera from her tidy stable and went on chewing her cud impassively. We all fell into an absorbed silence, surrendering to our love. Some of us must have been thinking about the great scientific achievements that a revolution made possible, others about what it would mean to be able to guarantee a liter of milk per day to every child in their own country. I thought that if my Chilean friend Manuel would like to be a palm tree, I yearned beyond all else to transform myself into this dumb, imperturbable animal and know peace. Finally, from a corner, the voice of someone with a thick Brazilian accent, a tall man well along in years, asked, "Compañero, does the senor think Cuba is going to keep this great discovery for itself? Doesn't it have an obligation to share una maravilla como esta with all the countries in Latin America? The children of the entire continent will be grateful." "Compañero," the director answered happily, "all that Cuba has is for its sister peoples. And of course, with our children's hunger at stake, that includes Daisy and all its descendants too." And we all went off to eat and celebrate a future without hunger. During the week of our privileged status as guests, we didn't visit a single art gallery or attend one concert or play. We were not invited to meet with representatives of the Cuban publishing industry or converse with an author or even visit the editorial offices of Granma, the daily newspaper. I didn't ask why, because it is an inescapable condition of organized tours that the question, why are we seeing this but not that, does not exist. On the last day of the expedition, we went to visit a Cuban insane asylum, because at that point it was one of Fidel's great enthusiasms. When we saw the director of the National Psychiatric Hospital, who came to the door of the Wawa to welcome us, we delegates grew enthusiastic as well. I never learned whether the doctor, Comandante Eduardo Bernabé Ordaz, was in fact once a guerrilla, but he was one of the half-dozen men who were allowed to emulate Fidel and cultivate the wilderness beard that the rebels had let grow during the war. Otherwise, beards were prohibited. After Manuel Piñeiro, the head of intelligence in Cuba, the best known among them was this Dr. Ordaz, whose hairy face now bore a smile of complete happiness as he caressed and played with his beard above his snow-white medical jacket. He gave us all the impression of a man about to break into an aria or a vigorous folk dance, or to sink his fork into a gigantic suckling pig. When I stepped down off the bus, he welcomed me with an embrace that could have immobilized a lion. For a moment, I thought with some alarm, and I wasn't the only one, that he was a patient in the hospital. And in fact, when we went in, the patients we saw seemed to be immersed in the same galloping happiness as their physician. We followed him from room to room with smiles that grew more and more like his as he euphorically explained. La Revolución believed that productive labor was the root and justification of the new man, and that mental illnesses were the result of a disjunction between the patient and his social environment. What grew ill, if I recall the explanation correctly, was not the person himself, but his relationship to society. So that, if work conferred dignity on healthy Cubans, why deny the sick the chance to work and be revolutionaries as well? Here in the hospital, the patients carried out productive labor on farms and in workshops. In the new Cuban society, not even the psychiatric patients would be infantilized. One example. Though mirrors were banned from most mental hospitals, here in the Psiquiátrico Nacional, the patients had the right to recognize his reflection and contemplate himself. Gazing blindly at a row of patients in ordinary clothes, street clothes, who were offering us the spectacle of their huge merriment, I thought bitterly of the absence of mirrors in the studios, in the dance studios of Cubanacan, where I taught. But at that moment, my eye happened to fall on a delegate I hadn't previously noticed. And both patients and mirrors dissolved into thin air, because I knew immediately that I was born for him. His name was Luis. He was a guerrilla. And I had no more than 3 dialogues with him, all of them brief, before I never saw him again. During the days and weeks I spent calling out to him in my thoughts, as if it were with a long, pleading moan, there was never any response. But I'm grateful to him for the experience of that instantaneous blaze of passion. It had never happened to me before and has never happened since. He didn't tell me much about his life. I had no time to notice whether he was good looking or not. I never learned whether he had any kind of profession or whether he liked the same books I did. I understood before he told me that he was a guerrilla and that he had been in jail. He was very thin and had the expression of someone struggling to overcome a great weariness. And something in his way of walking and slightly tilting his torso to one side made it seem as if he had been frighteningly mistreated. He wasn't tall, he wasn't short. He had large eyes and a sweetness of manner that seemed inconceivable to me in someone who had been so tortured. Among other sensations, his presence brought me intense relief from the omnipresent Cuban machismo that made even my friend Galo's statements into stentorian and incontrovertible pronouncements. From all of that, from arrogance and confusion, rhetoric and exhortations, my doubts and the absolute answers that were crushing me, Luis seemed from the first moment to be a refuge and defense. Hola. ¿Qué tal? Hot, isn't it? Thus went the first glowing dialogue of love. In the hospital gardens, Dr. Ordaz's patients invited us to watch a musical performance. I stood next to Luis, so close I could smell the faint, resinous scent of his skin. The show may have been grotesque, or in the final analysis, highly interesting, for the avant-garde gap between the codified gestures of the interpreters of Cuban traditional music and this imitation of them performed by a group of enthusiastic schizophrenics. But at that moment, it struck me as heavenly. Between one musical number and the next, Luis and I exchanged a few phrases, though I had to make an effort to get my voice out of my throat. I don't remember a single word we said, except that they were all trivial. I was dying to ask him everything. Why Vietnam? Why not art? Why did I have to feel so out of place? And finally, I asked him where he was staying, and he told me in his characteristically sweet, protective tone that for security reasons, he was not allowed to disclose that information to anyone. And then I understood that my presence made him uneasy, and that although he seemed as winged and luminous as an angel to me, I was ugly and clumsy, nothing more than an unworthy dancer standing next to a redeemer of the world. I couldn't decide whether it would be worse to stay there next to him, breathing in his smell but making a fool of myself, or to push my way through the other delegates and take refuge back in the bus. Just then, an old woman in flip-flops with a bandana tied around her head walked to the middle of the improvised open-air stage and began singing La Bayamesa, the Cuban national song, in a hoarse and off-key voice. At the same time, I saw behind her a file of delegates making their way down the hill from the parking lot to join our group. "Esto es magnífico," said the director of the hospital, bursting with happiness and interrupting La Bayamesa. "Our heroic Vietnamese compañeros have just arrived. Compañeros, por favor. Let's have a round of aplausos. Aplausos, por favor. These comrades are honoring us, truly honoring us with their presence. Por favor, compañera." And he gave a smile of welcome to a girl whose beauty was as fragile as a wing, wearing a traditional ao dai embroidered with red. Eyes watering and throats tight, we all applauded, and she hid her head in embarrassment and bent her waist in thanks as if moved by a breeze. "Nuestra camarada will be spending a few months in Cuba," said the director. "She's not even 21 years old. I was 20. But she has the singular, the unimaginable distinction of having deactivated all by herself more than 300 fragmentation bombs dropped onto her land by the imperialists. Insofar as it is able, Cuba wants to contribute to Vietnam's heroic struggle and has offered this great heroine reconstructive surgery on her hands. And then I saw that the figure who smiled and smiled in front of us had, for hands, 2 seared lumps of scars, adorned with a few protuberances of crooked flesh. "You're a come mierda," I told myself, a shit-eater. "You're unredeemable." I found some silence and solitude in a hospital bathroom and stood looking at myself in the mirror for a while, without finding anyone there to be friends with.
Thank you, Alma. I think,
Michael
Muchas
wants to say
gracias.
something.
muchas gracias.
I'll give you a flower,
Gracias.
red or white.
Why, are we leaving? Are we not talking a little bit?
So yeah,
Huh?
I'm just caught up in the
Oh, come on,
the
sit
book.
on my lap
Talk.
over here.
Maybe no one wants to talk, it's lunchtime.
No, but it's striking when you read these stories that you're not romanticizing this at all, and clearly there was a struggle going on within you that was very clear in this passage that you read. But what was also striking to me was the great optimism of the people, and wasn't that something that really moved you? I mean, you seem to be always comparing yourself and measuring yourself against the revolution. But at the same time, wasn't there something transporting about the optimism, however idealistic it might have been?
Well, I was not only comparing myself to the ideals of the revolution, I was comparing the ideals of the revolution to the reality of the revolution that I had before me, and the reality of all of my friends comparing themselves to the goals of the revolution and finding the goals of the revolution failing and themselves failing. So everyone in Cuba in that terrible year, the revolution had promised 10 million tons of sugarcane as a harvest and had failed to meet that and had ruined the economy of the country for years to come as a result of that wild dream by Fidel. Everybody was living in Fidel's dream and failing to meet Fidel's dream, including Fidel. And so I was trapped in that contradiction constantly. All my friends were artists. My gay friends had been sent to gay prison. The unidades UMAPs, Unidades de Asistencia Productiva. So they were called productive assistance unities, but they were work camps. And all my friends had been sent there. And all my friends wanted to be revolutionaries. And so it was this tension that I think at some point made life unbearable for me. Yeah. And at the same time, there was this beautiful Vietnamese woman with stumps for hands facing the Vietnamese war, deactivating US bombs, deactivating the bombs made and dropped by the country in which I lived. And so the war that I had been so oblivious of, because I was an artist and beauty was the only thing that mattered. So I can't tell you the number of cages I was trapped in.
But don't you think that, I mean, clearly this was a very formative experience, and clearly you were very moved by the physical courage of that woman, but you yourself have exhibited considerable physical courage working in the places that you've worked and covering the stories that you've covered. This shaped you, this moment?
It did, yeah. I hadn't thought of that, but yes, it did. Although I remember myself being much more shaped when I stumbled into journalism and the Nicaragua Revolution by Dora Maria Telles, who was a Sandinista guerrilla. And I did a little oral biography of the Sandinistas after the revolution, and I interviewed her, and she talks about going up to the mountains to be a guerrilla for the first time, and that really stuck with me. And trying to keep up with the more seasoned guerrillas and the not enough food and the mosquitoes and the heat and not seeing any color but green. She was so sick of green, she was dying for any other color because it was all the jungle. And feeling that she couldn't do it and saying, if other women have done it before me, then I must be able to do it too. And every time she thought she was failing, she would say, if other women have done it before me, then I must be able to do it too. And that, I think the Vietnamese girl was always in the back of my mind, but Dora Maria Telles' words were always in the back of my mind.
If she can do it, I can do it too.
If she could do it, if another woman could do it, I could do it too.
Yeah, we're not all fortunate to have an experience that really sets us
Well,
on
thank
the
you.
path in that way. But I just wanted to just talk, I don't know how much time we have, but just maybe one more thing. This notion that okay, you were teaching dance and you were ostensibly teaching modern dance, but I recall in the book there was a ballet school, and the ballet was quite the thing.
The thing.
And there was the folk dance as well. So there were these kinds of categories that were prioritized in different ways, with the ballet being the most vaunted of the forms. And I was thinking, because I live in Egypt, and this also happened in Egypt when it was quite under Soviet influence in the 1950s, 1960s, where we had Oriental dance, but that was very much put to the side in favor of the ballet. But there was still value in that as an artist. People were appreciated, but also in the folk dance, you know, because the folk dance was the dance of the people. So was it this idea of the role of the artist, which you describe as being completely dismissed, and yet there was a place for the artist in the revolution?
Sort of. First of all, public announcement, Alicia Alonso, the great, great dancer, and terrible repressor of art, I think, died yesterday at the age of 98. She was a dancer of exceptional emotional beauty and technique as well. Ballet is essentially conservative. It's a French courtly form, and it is also exquisitely beautiful. So this was convenient in the Soviet Union to have a conservative, beautiful art form, and that was transferred directly onto the Cuban Revolution. I, as a practitioner of modern dance, dance being a free form, as you were saying the other day about jazz artists, was not so welcome,
Right.
and had to fight to open a space for itself. And because Cuban folk forms were both black in origin and very often erotic, and we know that el erotismo is also subversive and free, it was repressed. Yeah. So the revolution's relationship to art was always contradictory. Art is prestigious, beauty is welcomed, but dentro de la revolución todo, fuera de la revolución nada, within the revolution. Everything outside the revolution, nothing, as Fidel told artists. And everybody who was waiting for better words from him went, no.
Yeah. Well, I just wonder, I mean, now it doesn't seem like of course don't seem to be revolutions, at least not with the idea of the collective as the goal of the revolution. No. Nor does there seem to be an art form that represents the revolution.
No.
Well, what are you going to do?
The difficulty of art right now, social art right now, is that socialist art turned out to be full of lies, and so it was not art. Revolutionary art turned out to be full of cliches, and so it was not art. And so unless I think you're a writer, in which case there is a path. But for the visual arts, for example, what is the path that is left to be contestativo, to be content?
Protagonist.
To be what?
A protagonist.
No, to be a questioner or confronter of reality, and at the same time communicate, and at the same time create community, and what Juno was referring to as solidarity and compassion. How do you do that at this tremendous moment that we are facing today. A writer can do it because it's intellectual, but how do other artists do this? How do modern dancers do it? How does ballet do it? It's a tremendously difficult moment.
I guess the art is always reflecting in a way where our society is at. There was just one more thing. I was very struck in your book. You spoke about how there was a tremendous earthquake in Peru. I guess it was 1971 or
70.
Yeah, 1970. And at this time, the Cubans were giving their blood to the Peruvians. I mean, we talk about connectivity. That was connectivity.
Well, these are the things that kept me tied to the Cuban Revolution for so long, too. Because while I was there was this horrendous earthquake and landslide. It was a landslide that killed most people down the canyon in Peru. And thousands of people were killed, but thousands of others were injured. And what Fidel said, he had this tremendous power to move. Also at that time, most young people remember him as this quavering old man, but at that time, he was fantastically good looking. And so he would get up and say, we must have solidarity and compassion with our brothers in Peru. And every Cuban, every revolutionary must go and donate blood. And I witnessed that. As a dancer, people with extreme forms of physical effort were exempt. But I watched the lines of Cubans going to give blood. I thought, how is it that I don't know what this kind of solidarity is? How is it that I have never even thought about this kind of solidarity? So again, that tightrope in the revolution. Yeah. And what kept the revolution going for so long, and perhaps even among some people today. Although one of the failures of the book is that I don't talk about all the people who were disaffected from the revolution, even back then. But
I mean, it stands as a record of something and that I think is very, very worth remembering now. I mean, this revolution may have failed, and certainly it failed, and there were, many cracks in the pedestal of Fidel, but yet there was something very beautiful, precisely as Juno say, as you say, in this idea of solidarity, and this idea, but in also the belief in the possibility of an ideal collective. What possibilities do we believe in today? And we were maybe fortunate because at that time art was very much, working to open towards those possibilities. And it could happen again, but certainly this book, I think, really gives you a strong flavor of that possibility, and we're very grateful.
I think it was a time of intense emotion, and intense social emotion, and we would all like to have the possibility of intense social emotion again, and not to live in a world where all the models have failed us.
Yeah.
The revolutionary models, and God knows the capitalist models, which are driving us to the apocalypse. Yes, to find a space for beautiful emotions is hard. And maybe that's why we're all dumping on beauty now, but right. Let's have some beautiful emotions.
And why we all need to join the underground again. What, darling? Yeah, does anybody have any questions for Alma? Yes?
Or questions about when we're going to have lunch.
Okay. Yeah? Anybody? Yes?
I just wanted to ask, at the time you were there during the revolution, was Che Guevara there at that time?
No, he was dead.
He was what? He was already gone?
He was dead.
Dead. So this was after?
He died in 1967.
Yeah.
So
and you were there in what year?
1967.
No, you were there.
I was there in 1970.
70.
So one of the things that was a source of constant pain for me was the constant exhortation, ser como el Che, be like Che. And I was about the furthest thing from Che that could be imagined. But also, to be like Che was to want to die. And I didn't realize how much vitality I had in me.
Young, youth.
That was my problem, you know. I
wish-
didn't want to die, and yet I tried to.
Es?
Hi, thank you for your thoughts. I was just wondering, in that time, how was the Afro-Cuban folklore dance? How was it? Was it ever seen? Because right now it's booming, and I'm wondering in the revolution, since it came from Afro descendants, how was it promoted or not promoted?
In the school where I taught, there were two, and it was, by the way, a school where students started at age 8. It was a whole interesting thing about this school. It was basically a place, where, as the ballet school still is, where poor children were recruited to become dancers. And so at the age of 8, they were put in internados that were on the campus. And this was true. And everybody had to study folk dance and modern dance. And so the modern dance teacher is, in the book and in real life, was one of my best friends, Teresa Fernandez. And what she did was she codified essentially the rumba, sobre todo, into steps that could be taught. And so everything was so complicated. The rumba was taught, but it was codified, and it was understood to be something that was good for export. So there was the Conjunto Folclórico Nacional, which went on tour around the world. But at that time, the rumba and Afro-Cuban dance and song were not permitted. And so, for example, the Cuban drum players and the Cuban dancers who came and kind of taught the basic steps were not known as followers of Santeria, and those were not known as Santeria steps. They were known as informantes, informers, like anthropological sources. But I saw a great deal of Cuban folk dance thanks to the informantes, who were beautiful beyond words. We could talk a bit about Cuban racism, which was a factor in the repression of folk dance, obviously, which was Cuban, the subversive way that slaves found to express themselves and the religion was Santeria. And the revolution's racism and Fidel's own racism. But we won't talk about that.
Yeah.
The sense of death in revolution. Was the sense of Cuban death similar to the sense of Mexican death?
No.
Different celebration.
Different celebration. And not only that, I think it's one of the reasons that, say, Mexicans travel to Colombia and feel at home, and Colombians travel to Mexico and feel at home, but we travel to the Caribbean or we travel to Brazil and we feel totally out of place. Because what there is innate in the Cuban spirit is celebration. And I would say probably in the Caribbean spirit. It's in the music, it's in the speech, it's in that syncopated talk that Juno knows how to translate so well onto the page. When Maya Plisetskaya's brother, Vasily Plisetski, Maya Plisetskaya, one of the great Soviet ballet dancers, and Vasily Plisetski travels to Cuba to really teach and set the basis for the Cuban ballet school. He spent several years there, and he said, there is no pueblo more able to dance, more innately dancey than the Cuban pueblo. It's just in the veins, no? And so that Cuban vitality, which I often found totally overwhelming, the more depressed I got, the more overwhelming it was. is what Cubans face death with. We Mexicans face death with a defiance of its inevitability. The Cubans face death by being alive.
So maybe we can have some Cuban music before we cut out. Thank you. Thank you, Alma.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'll take the red rose for passion
Oh,
Well,
thank
we
you.
have two.
and the white one for spirit. There we go. Thank you all.
Bless you.
What about the music?